Hi, can you hear me? I think so. My name's Sophia and I work for JNCC, the Joint Nature Conservation Committee. In terms of marine conservation, looks after the conservation of offshore waters around the UK, so that's beyond 12 nautical miles. Michael MacLeod here is from Marine Scotland, which is a government department from Scotland. Today we're going to provide a brief presentation of what we've been doing in the UK to identify possible fisheries management measures for 2 Natura 2000 SACs, or special areas of conservation, and then Mike will also provide some further detail on inshore fisheries management measures that they've been forwarding. So there are 2 sites that we've been looking at, which are Stanton Banks and Hague Frass Site of Community Importance. In case there's differences between the different countries, a site of community importance is a site which has been approved by the European Commission, but yet is to put in place management measures. Then I'll be sort of going over how MAIA's helped us develop these workshops to engage fishermen and the next steps involved to put in place these fisheries management measures. So, Stanton Banks, the first of the sites, it's located in northwest Scotland, just off the coast of the Hebrides. It's a site to protect reef features, and it was adopted by the Commission in 2009 as a site of community importance following public consultation. Following this public consultation, the boundaries of the site was defined more closely to follow the reef features. Conservation objectives for the site is to restore it to favourable condition, since it's a reef site and there is fishing activity in and around the area. Hague Frass is the second site that we've been looking at. Hague Frass is located in southwest England, just below the Republic of Ireland. Again, this site has been identified for its reef features, and its conservation objectives have been to restore it to favourable condition. As with Stanton Banks, the site's the boundary following the public consultation. The boundary was redrawn to match the reef features a little bit more closely, as we understood in that time. Both these sites were chosen as pilot sites since they were adopted in 2009, and management measures for sites need to be adopted within 6 years of approval by the Commission. So a little bit more. So basically, this is where the MAIA project came into play. Through the work package 3 of the MAIA project, we had planned to put in place a workshop with fishermen and management authorities to discuss possible measures. Let me just have a look. So for Stanton Banks, the workshop took place in Glasgow, and that was 20th of October last year. Glasgow was chosen as location because it was relatively close to the main port of landing for where fishermen land the catch, and also because Marine Scotland provided us with a location which was free, which helped save costs. Prior to the workshop, we produced summary documentations of the SAC selection assessment document and the conservation objectives, as well as options for management measures, which Marine Scotland provided, which was Mike. And then those that attended, we had 19 fishermen and fishing representatives, one person who was also a representative of the North West Waters RAC, and who was actually working for RSPB, Royal Society for Protection of Birds. These delegates were identified by looking at VMS data and seeing which nations fished in and around the area, and also by contacting the RACs to see who would be interested in participating in this workshop. Various management options were discussed, from no additional management measure, total closure, to no fishing except pelagic or pelagic and static demersal fishing. Each of these options were discussed in various levels of details, along with the different fishing activities that occur in and around the site. The option which was most elaborated upon was zoned proposal. You can see from one of these, the picture on this side here, there were 3 areas that we looked at in specific where currently demersal trawling activities occur and where it could be possible to continue those activities within those areas since reef features aren't within them. Actions which came out from the workshop was to look at these areas in more detail, along with point data that which Marine Scotland provided us with, as well as the fishermen, and new data that we've received from surveys, and so to refine these boundaries a bit more closely. For Hague Frass, similar type of workshops, similar layouts. We organised this one in Rennes in collaboration with the Comité Régional de Pêche. They hosted us in Rennes. This took place in November the 24th. And again, there was about 20 people who attended the workshop, 5 fishing representatives, a Cornish fisherman, and a UK representative, including a member of North West Waters RAC. Again, the same sort of management options were discussed, looking at the various options along with the different fishing activities that occur in and around the area. It was decided that potting, there was static gear. There was minimal static gear occurring within the site because of tide regimes and the size of site. And then certain areas were looked as to whether possibly demersal tow gear could continue. No decisions were made within the workshop, but actions taken away were for the agency to look more closely at fishing activity occurring in the area, along with new survey data that we've collected, because we actually found out just last year that the reef feature was in a slightly different location than we originally thought, as you can see from the top map here. But when we discussed this with those present, no one seemed too surprised, as generally fishermen try to avoid reef features. So, next steps, things that we have done since the workshops and are yet to do. So, following the workshops, we've collected VMS point data to really identify more precisely where fishing activities occur. The fishermen that attended the workshops have provided us with more detailed data of where they're carrying out their activities. And we've begun pulling together information to complete the 11 steps outlined within the European Commission Natura 2000 Fisheries Management Measure Guidance. This is an 11-step process, which I'll go into more detail in a moment. What we're left to do, the management authorities will need to write proposals for the sites, and then we'll need to go through a series of public consultation as well as meeting with the RACs again to see if any changes have occurred since it was last discussed at the workshops. The sites are intended to be designated by next year. So the 11 steps process. So within this guidance, we are required to provide a comprehensive description of the Natura features, scientific role of the sites, rationale of the sites, spatial extent of the boundary and justified in terms of conservation objectives. This will be done using the current, the revised version of the SAC selection assessment documents and conservation objectives and advice and operations. Within this guidance is also outlined that we need to provide detailed information on threats to the habitats and species from the different fishing gear, fleet activity occurring in and around the site, bycatch and seasonal trends over the last 3 years. For this, we'll use the point data that has been provided to us. Other aspects that we need to complete in collaboration with the management authorities and CFAS and Marine Scotland Science will be evaluation of displacement of fishing effort, advice on possible fisheries management measures to maintain the habitat feature in its favourable condition, control measures envisaged, and measures to monitor and assess the recovery of the site. So this is all stuff we're yet to do, so I probably would like to speak to those of you who've gone through this process to see what your experience is if you have had to complete these 11 steps. I'm just going to hand you over to Mike now, who will give you more detail on lessons learned.
Thank you, thank you, Sophie. Can you hear me okay? Okay. I'll start off a bit explain who Marine Scotland are. We're a directorate of the Scottish Government, and in a nutshell, our role is to manage Scotland seas, for sustainable development and economic growth. So our work ranges from marine nature conservation through fisheries protection, fisheries science, to renewables and marine planning and everything in between. I'd like to pick up on a point that Gonzalo made earlier on, was that you have to have people who work with people, and I suppose that would be my role in these kind of processes, to be that interface between science and our external stakeholders. Some of the key lessons we've learned, that you have to start off with a level playing field. So it's important that if you're going for any kind of measure, that you get everybody in the tent with you, so to speak, right at the start of the process. We used the North West Waters RAC from the very start of the process, which was really helpful in terms of getting the message out to stakeholders that we were doing this process. It's certainly beyond national boundaries. Some of the lessons learned, what I mean by saying we started with an open mind within boundaries, is that although we had a range of options on the table, we hadn't set our heart on any of them. We very much allowed the people at the workshops to give us their opinions and also other suggestions. For example, that's how we came towards zonal proposal at the Stanton Bank workshop, which we never had on the table as one of our options initially. Access to VMS data is certainly in the UK an extremely complex issue due to the Data Protection Act. In a rather strange position up until recently, we as Marine Scotland couldn't give JNCC data held by another part of Marine Scotland because of the Data Protection Act. So Sophie and colleagues were trying to help me do my job, but another part of Marine Scotland was stopping that from occurring. But fortunately, as part of this process, we finally found a resolution to that problem. So that's one of the benefits that's come out of the project for us all. The importance of data. What's happened there? Yeah. I think I may be switching that on and off from my leg. I apologise. That sounds better. The importance of access to data is, for me as the policy maker who advises government what to do, that means that the advice we get from our advisors is far more precise, whereas when they don't have access to all the data, then they naturally have to be more precautionary in their advice, which then upsets our stakeholders more than it should. So there is a benefit to us all to have all the data. Another aspect was that we did struggle at the outset, certainly, was to get data from other member states who participate in the fishery around Stanton Bank. And that's something that I think definitely has to be improved. And perhaps there's some way through networks like this that access and being able to find the right people to ask for the information, hopefully a network can come out of this process. The key point is to make sure your workshop is at a venue that suits your audience, especially when it's fishermen. Glasgow worked perfect for Stanton Bank, probably partly due to the fact that we paid subsistence for the fishermen to come and stay overnight in a hotel, which I'm sure was well received by them. And Glasgow's ideal for international connections for stakeholders who came from Ireland. At the Wren workshop, there was a strong indication from our French colleagues that it would have been better to have had the meeting at the coast at one of the ports, and that may have got us more fishermen involved in the process. But ultimately, with fishermen especially, there's no hard and fast rules to how they work. They go to sea when they need to be at sea, and you might set a date that suits them at the time, but then their pattern changes and they can't make it. But that's something we all have to live with, and I don't think we can ever resolve that. After the Stanton Back workshop, we helpfully received quite a lot of what we call plotter data, fishermen's actual data about where he actually does his fishing operations. And in an ideal world, had we had that before the workshops, that could have been incorporated into the GIS, which would have made comparing and contrasting VMS with the environmental data and with fishermen's actual knowledge and data so much easier. We were all looking at different pieces of paper and trying to do a sort of in your own mind and by your eye, and that simply is too difficult. But probably the most powerful lesson for me is the value of a fisherman's, not so much his data, but the knowledge that goes with that data. And we've started to call that practical environmental knowledge. So he has all his toes, but then he can tell you exactly, pretty much exactly what the seabed is like in that area. For example, we had a meeting not that long ago about a SEC proposal, and there was toes on top of what we believe to be reef, and it is bedrock reef. But the fishermen said there must be sand or some other sediment on top of the reef. And from the surveys, there was actually a photograph taking off the seabed, and sure enough, the bedrock reef was covered in sand. So it's just an interesting validation of what we knew and what the fishermen knew from their own knowledge. One of the questions that always comes up in terms of managing Natura sites is whether you should have voluntary measures or whether they should be statutory, in other words, whether they have a legal backing. Certainly in Scotland we are not fussy about the method used. What is important is that the features are conserved, and however you manage your site, that is the most important thing. And furthermore, it's about getting stakeholders buy-in, because it doesn't matter what measures you put in place if stakeholders don't believe in the measures that you've taken. Then all it takes is one person to go and do something reckless. The two columns here give you some of the pros and cons of taking statutory measures. And obviously the benefit of statutory measures are that you have legal recourse against somebody who has committed an offence. Particularly good for dealing with single sector issues, and particularly good for offshore locations where the common fisheries policy is effectively the competent authority. Simply put, trying to put a voluntary measure in place for an offshore SEC would be completely, well, not impossible, but very close to impossible, because fishing by its nature is very dynamic. So the CFP can change on a year-by-year basis, so quotas can change, the amount of effort people have can change, where the fish stocks are changes as well. So who you might agree a voluntary plan with today, in 12 months' time, there might be a completely different set of fishermen who you've never spoken to before, who are wanting to work in the area. Of course, statutory measures often anger stakeholders because, they make the presumption that you're saying that they are damaging things when that might not actually be the case. And certainly through the CFP process, it takes a long time to get to the measures. Indeed, after we submit a proposal, it could take up to 2 years to go through the European processes of getting a co-decision and approval. Well, hopefully the CFP reform will shorten that time frame. And ultimately, legal action doesn't fix environmental damage. Giving somebody a fine in court doesn't remedy the damage caused. Voluntary measures, we find these are far more beneficial in inshore waters, particularly where there is more than one sector involved, because you have to consider cumulative effects and so on and so forth. It gives people a sense of control and allows you to be as flexible as you want in your the measures taken. One of the problems with statutory measures, it has to be frameable in a legal context, which often makes the measures rigid. So voluntary gives you that flexibility to be creative. And when you get stakeholders involved and believing in what you're doing, they actually become the de facto protectors of the site, because they police themselves and others to make sure they are behaving in an appropriate manner. The two negatives to voluntary measures are the so-called rotten apple in the barrel. All it takes is one person to break the voluntary measure, and that either opens the floodgates or damage gets done anyway. And of course, there's no legal remedy because it is a voluntary scheme. I'd like to use one of the examples of where we have successfully used voluntary measures and why you probably couldn't have framed statutory fisheries measures for this issue. It's a small West Coast special area of conservation for subtidal sandbanks, and it features probably the most extensive merle beds in UK waters, I think, or pretty much the most extensive one. One of the interesting facts, although the sandbanks extend deeper than 20 metres, all the merle is shallower than 20 metres. And of course, I don't need to tell anybody in here that merle is highly sensitive to disturbance, and recovery is pretty much impossible. And pretty much every type of fishing is potentially damaging or causes modification to merle. So it is one of these habitats that does require fairly strict management. So, in gathering together what is now referred to as the Management Forum, it was a case of identifying all the current activities that were taking place, both fishing and other sectors, but I'd like to focus on the fishing aspects. And the first thing we discovered was that no creel fishing occurs on the merle, simply because the target species they fish for just don't live there. We discovered that the scallop dredging that was taking place, which was a major concern, we discovered that nobody was ever fishing shallower than 20 metres, which probably explains why the merle beds are the most extensive and dense ones that we have. And we also found that there was quite a lot of hand diving going on, both for razorfish and for scallops in different depths of water. So the outcomes from this were that obviously creel fishing not happening over the Merrill, no point in having any kind of management for that. For dredging, although it was never occurring below 20 metres, the decision by the management group was that it was better to put a slight buffer to that. So the voluntary agreement reached was that nobody would tow scallop gear shallower than 25 metres. Which, if you can imagine trying to frame a legal instrument, I'm not sure any lawyer would write you one based on a depth contour. They much prefer hard and fast coordinates, which would have been impossible to frame in a legal sense. Moorings, which are basically for boats, recreational boats to anchor at. Obviously, if you drop a 1 ton concrete block on top of a Merrill bed, it's not going to have a very nice ending. So any moorings that are given consent must be located away from the Merrill beds. And there's a presumption against the extraction of aggregates and sand across the whole of the SAC. There's also an educational programme ongoing so that recreational users are aware of the habitats and the potential impact of the things that they may do. And there's also been research into the impacts that fish farming can have on the habitat. And essentially there's a presumption against any fish farm being located over a Merrill bed, irrespective of where it is in Scottish waters now. And the divers who do the hand diving informally gather data on the condition of the habitat and report to the management forum if they identify any changes or damage. And I mean, the site is still well managed today, 12 years on from the management plan first being devised, so it's a good indication of success for voluntary measures. Thank you.
Thank you.